afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back to the Global Outlook track on day 2 of the Warsaw Security Forum. My name is Terry Martin. If you didn't catch that this morning, if you weren't around, we've had a remarkable morning already. The motto of this year's forum, as you know, is "Divided we fall." Well, after a day and a half of discussions here, I don't get the impression that any of you, anyone among us, is about to fall. We are still standing very much together. But we still have a lot to talk about. And this afternoon on the stage, we're going to be exploring how forces are shaping Europe's place in the world. It is changing. There's a lot going on. Much as it is in flux, and we're going to get into some of that today. We have 4 panel discussions and 2 one-on-one conversations over the course of the afternoon here. That will carry us through to 5:30, after which we're going to have a very interesting reception hosted by our partner country this year, France, so we can look forward to that. So we're going to begin with a very timely, very important conversation that's something that I'm a news journalist, by the way, so this is something I talk about all the time. It's called From Kyiv to Washington, Assessing the War, the West's Response, and What Comes Next. Please welcome your moderator for this conversation, Katarzyna Pisarska, chair of the Warsaw Security Forum, needs no introduction, together with her guest, Lieutenant General Kellogg, U.S. Presidential Envoy for Ukraine.
Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome after the lunch break. My God, it's still a full room, so I hope we'll have a bit of time for some questions from this great audience. But first and foremost, welcome General Kate Kellogg back to Warsaw. It's great to have you here with us.
Thank you for having me here. Appreciate it.
So General Kate Kellogg doesn't need a great introduction. He is the presidential envoy for Ukraine, of course, President Trump's envoy for Ukraine, but he's also a highly decorated former Free Star officer in the United States Army with over 35 years of experience of service. He has been deployed everywhere from Vietnam to Europe to the Pacific, Middle East, Africa. I think you said 23 global, yes, and state military moves. That's what your family had to go through. Pretty amazing. But he has also served in the administration. He was a national security advisor to former Vice President Mike Pence and served as the Chief of Staff and Executive Secretary of the National Security Council. General Kellogg, it's great to have you here in Warsaw. We were together in Kyiv just 2 weeks ago, and I would actually want to start from there. Coming back from Kyiv, and of course being all the time in the loop on what's happening, what is your assessment currently of the situation in Ukraine, both on the front line, but also in terms of moral in the Ukrainian cities, which, as we see every single night, are so badly attacked, assaulted, with civilians killed every single day?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I think that everybody listening and has been following this war. You know, we're looking at a war that Europe has not seen since World War II, in the complexity of the war, about the losses of the war, the longevity of the war. Remember, this was a war that even we in the United States we said was going to be over in 3 days. Remember, we, the United States, offered President Zelensky a ride out of town, and he made the comment, "I don't need a ride, I need ammunition." And he said, when he told it to the Russians, "You're going to see my face, you're not going to see my back." And this war is now in its 4th year. It's so hard to imagine, and the depth of this war. Not only the longevity, but the cost. I mean, when you look at the simple cost of this war, and one of the reasons we're trying to help get an end to it is the casualty levels alone, the men and women that are killed on both sides. We're talking well over 1 million. Think about that. Those are losses that we haven't seen since World War II in history. You know, the Soviet Union left Afghanistan after losing 16,000. We left Vietnam after losing 65,000. And we're not talking 65,000, we're not talking hundreds of thousands, we're talking hundreds of thousands. Now, with the state of the war as we see it today, is that, I've said this very publicly, that Russia is not winning this war. Because they've got a definition of victory that I do. And what I mean by that is they have not crossed west of the Dnieper River. They have not been able to take Kyiv. They have not been able to take Kharkiv. They haven't taken Odessa. They haven't made any of their goals. This was, quote, a special military operation. And yet the Ukrainians have fought boldly. They fought exceptionally well. The Russians have been able to take most of Luhansk Oblast, about 70% of Donetsk Oblast, about the same amount of Kherson, the same amount of Zaporizhia, and of course we have Crimea, which was the 2014 war. So when you look at the war, it's gone on a long time. The Ukrainians are fighting with great valor, with great courage, in a very modern war that probably everybody should look at. So I think the end state is we're trying to get to a position where maintenance of sovereignty of Ukraine and the war is over and the killing stops, because the killing is industrial strength. And you have to look at it in that regard of what it means if you're Ukrainian and what you want to, how you want to stop this fight. And I've been in Ukraine a lot, and I look at the resiliency of the people and the resiliency of the population. We don't have modern day evaluations of how this looks, but I think it only goes back to World War II and what you saw what's happening in Kyiv, what's happened in London during the Blitz. So I think the Ukrainians have been incredibly indomitable in what they're doing, and I have, once we Ukrainians are on board to get to either a ceasefire or permanent peace, and we're just pushing back on the Russians now for Putin to make that call. So it's a long answer, short question. It may sound simplistic to you, but bottom line, it's a major war that needs to be brought to a close.
Thank you, General. You've been in the White House for the last few months when discussions were taking place about a possible peace deal between Ukraine and Russia. You've seen, the outcome of the Alaska summit, but most importantly, I think you've seen the statements of President Trump recently. I know you always say that you do not speak on behalf of President Trump. He speaks for himself. He has a very strong voice. But my question is, what is the understanding now when we see that the White House is pretty impatient with what's happening in Moscow? What is your reading of Russia? Why is Putin, he seems uninterested in a peace deal? And it seems that, something that the Trump administration wanted to put forward is not going to actually come to life.
Yeah, it's sort of like asking me, what is Putin thinking? Well, I won't solve that one at all, because I don't think any of us in this room can figure that one out.
What does the administration think he's thinking?
Well,
you have a lot of great advisors there.
Well, when you look at it, it's being the intermediary. The look at this was on a personal perspective. President Trump has been very personally engaged. And what he's done, and I give full credit to President Trump, and it's going to sound adversarial in a way. But, with President Biden, he never picked up the phone and talked to Putin once. You've got to talk to your enemies. You've got to talk to your friends as well. And to do that. And so making your lines of communication, opening them up to find out, what are you thinking? How do we get to an end state? He's done that. Talked to Zelensky. He's talked to Putin. He's talked to all of the allies.
So what did he find out in these talks?
Well, I think what's happened is if you're looking only at the public record, you're seeing that there's a level of, and I'm not just talking about President Trump, but Vice President Vance as well, and you're looking at Secretary Rubio, there's a level of frustration of, okay, look, we've reached a point of saying we know where the Ukrainians are. We're in a pretty good position with the Ukrainians, and Putin doesn't want to go there. And I think part of it is the fact that probably in his heart of hearts, he realizes he can't win this. This is an unwinnable fight for him long term. What he intended to do, he intended to subjugate Ukraine. It's not going to happen. He wanted a change of government. Not going to happen. Even though President Zelensky recently said, in which they're willing to eventually open up once they stop martial law, to head towards new elections. If you talk to, and you've been in there, we were there just 3 weeks ago, when you talk to the Ukrainian people, I mean, there's a level of resilience out there. I mean, they have gained no friendships in this war. with the Russians. And I think you're looking at the stability of a state, and they're going to go there. And we were asked a question just now at lunch about the role of the U.S. president. It's sort of like an intermediary role. I go back to what happened, and a lot of times I use the Treaty of Portsmouth in 1904, when Teddy Roosevelt was the intermediary at that time, between Russia and Japan in the Russo-Japanese War. You have to have an intermediary that actually can get you to some type of solution, some type of conclusion that both sides will trust to get you there. And that's kind of the state we're in right now. The United States has repeatedly said that the Ukrainians are going to be a key part of this because they're the only ones who make the determination on what it looks like, what a peace treaty looks like along with the Russians. And you have to default to them. It's their land, it's their sovereignty, and they're always going to be a key part of that. But we hope to have came out of Alaska. We were hoping for a trilateral, meaning trilateral, United States, Russia, and Ukraine to talk, and then you move into a bilateral from there with the Ukrainians and the Russians talking, but we're not there at all.
Mm-hmm. But do you personally, not the administration, believe that Putin wants peace talks or not? Do you believe he is willing and capable in the foreseeable future, let's say 12 months, sit down at a negotiating table? 12 months.
Well, I think one of my problems is I'm a perennial optimist, that you actually think to a point. You have to hope that eventually, you should never plan on hope because, hope's really not a really winning strategy. But you look and you say you have to make sure he understands he can't win over the long term. We're dealing with realism. I deal a lot with the Ukrainians, and they have a realistic approach to the world and what it looks like. And I think it's a very positive approach, and we have to try to emphasize that. And what I mean by that is I go back historically, and I look at what's happened in history over the years. And I go back to starting with Konrad Adenauer. Konrad Adenauer was the first chancellor of Germany. He knew he was never going to get a unified Germany in his watch on his time. But over time, he said eventually Germany will be united, which it was. Eventually, Germany will probably be part of NATO, which it is. And you have to look, what does this look like for the long term? Sometimes you can't just look at a short-term solution. You have to look at the long-term solution. And it's hard, and it's hard. But we kind of owe it to a special part of the population, to me, and there's the reason I'm so involved with it, is I don't look at those of us like in this audience right here. We're the old people. What I'm talking about are the kids. And kids shouldn't have to go to school in subways. Kids shouldn't have to go to school. And when they build up schools in the subway system, underground schools, if we as adults allow that to happen, then it's our fault. And we should try to find any type of solution to make sure that doesn't happen.
Thank you. And I think the room absolutely agrees with you, General Kellogg. But I have to push forward and talk now about the United States approach to the conflict. Congress, as you know, and we've discussed this before, has called for increased economic pressure on Russia. The Senate has prepared a sanction bill of secondary sanctions on countries such as China, India, Turkey that buy gas and oil. We talked about this also today during lunch. So a very effective, potentially, package of sanctions. And yet we've been waiting month after month after month, and neither has the Congress or the White House actually done a step forward in sanctioning putting in force these secondary sanctions. There actually has been no new sanctions on Russia since the new presidential administration has come in. Why is that?
Well, in our American way of government, there's three branches of government: judicial, the courts. Then you have the executive branch, president. And then you have the legislative branch. That's our Congress, the House of Representatives, and the Senate. They're all independent of each other. And so when you look at the sanctions with the bill that's in the Senate with the Senate leader with Thune and Lindsey Graham, they can pass the bill.
They can, but it seems they're waiting for a yes from President Trump.
But they are an independent organization. They can pass that bill today. And here's the example I use.
Why aren't they passing this?
Well, that's a question you need to ask Lindsey Graham and Thune. But I mean, this goes back to what the best thing I could say is, there's a really good example of this, and I use it as a parallel so you have an understanding of it. Years ago, the Congress passed a bill called the Jerusalem Act. And that bill stated that the United States of America would move their embassy in Israel from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. But it gave the president a waiver authority, 6-month waiver. It was waived 37 times. 37 times. But he had the authority to do it. President Trump came in, told Rex Tillerson, our Secretary of State, I'll give you one waiver. He gave him one waiver. That was the 37th. The next time, no waiver, we moved it. And the president was told, and I was in the meeting when it would happen, he would said from his Secretary of State at the time, if you sign this bill, moving the American embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, you will start the third intifada. The American embassy is in Jerusalem. Was there a third intifada? Nope. So sometimes the Senate has to do things, should do it, and they build inside that bill a waiver authority. They can do it. So that's the reason I use the Jerusalem Act as a waiver authority. So you know that's been done before, and you could do it again if you wanted to do it. But I talk about independent agencies. You know, that's when I look at Lindsey Graham, and I've talked to him recently, and I said, you can do that. I know you're waiting for President Trump, but you've given him an ability to waive it. He is the President of the United States. He has enormous influence. But if you want to do something, go ahead and do something about that. To me, it gives another round in your revolver for the president to use if he wants to use it. Has it been passed? No, it hasn't. It's an incredible bill in the sense of how many authors it has. Right now, I think the number is it's almost 92. So they have the ability of a lot of senators to do it. Ryan Fitzpatrick in the House of Representatives has got the same level, not at the same levels of numbers, but it's there to do it. So it makes it a bill that once you pass it, it'll become law, and it becomes a veto-proof law.
Thank you, General. I promise we'll get Senator Graham here to the Warsaw Security Forum, but in a year, so I hope before that actually this package actually passes. My last question before I take 2 or 3 questions from the audience, very short questions. When we were in Kyiv, I actually publicly asked you one question, and you asked me to ask it again.
Yeah, I know. My mistake.
And you're asking me all the time to. But we are in Poland. And as you remember, 2.5 weeks ago, Poland has been attacked by a sword of Russian drones. As we now understand, that has been the first attack of many different incursions happening in the Baltic states, in Romania, in Denmark. So the kind of posturing of Russia in the region. But in those first days, we received a lot of support from many countries, outspoken support. But for many days, there was deaf silence coming from the White House. And this deaf silence was heard specifically here, where the American-Polish relationship is at the heart of our thinking about security. How do you explain that?
Yeah, well, I'll go back to my military background. And in the military, you're taught one thing. First reports are always wrong. You know, wait to the second and third. And making sure what actually came in, and you find you examine what actually happened on where was the intent and what was done to do that. And this, it's serious. There's no doubt about it. That when you get 19 plus drones landing in the wrong place, it's either really bad targeting, really bad gamesmanship, or generalship that it's there. But when you look at it, you know, I turned around and I listened to your Foreign Minister Sikorsky, and his responses to it. And then that's going to look at a level of what is the response of Poland to an incursion like that. Or it's also the same thing, by the way, and I'll move away from Poland. But what happened is, example, recently with the Shadow Fleet. You know, the Shadow Fleet, that's the fleet of Russian tankers that is moving oil illicitly in violation of sanctions elsewhere around the world. And the Estonians, to their credit, seized one of those ships. And what happened was the Russians put a fighter above it. They took it back to St. Petersburg, and not much happened after it. You know, I look at sometimes you have to ask yourself the question of, okay, how do you respond to something like this? Well, the way you respond to something like this from a military background, that I would say is sometimes you raise what is called the risk level to do it. I'll give you a good example. A good example is a few years ago, 2015, the Russians had a Russian fighter invade Turkish airspace. What did the Turks do?
Shot it down.
They shot it down. Okay? That'll get your attention really fast, won't it? Now, that's what I mean about raising your risk level. I know it's the dangerous thing to do. I've got it. I understand that. But sometimes you have to ask yourselves, where do you go? How do you do it? And that's where, and I made the comment, it was actually picked up publicly about what your foreign minister, Sikorsky, said about it, is sometimes you want to go there to make sure everybody understands, look, this is serious business. For those of you sitting in uniform in this room, you know that. You know how serious it is. But sometimes you've all been trained that sometimes you have to raise your level of risk-taking, both politically and militarily, to get to an end state, whether you like it or not. And sometimes that's hard. I've done it. I've been there. I've seen it. Look, when we went after, in the first term of the Trump administration, when we went after and killed Qasem Soleimani, who was the leader of the Quds Force, we were told you're going to start a much larger war in the Middle East. And we didn't believe it. And what happened, we killed the Quds Force leader, and things actually quieted down. So that's something, it's complicated. Anybody who's been involved in diplomacy or national security understands it. There's never a clean answer. There's never an honest answer, honest in the sense of it makes it nothing black and white. I've never seen a black and white, for the most part, the discussion in any time anything's political like that. So it goes back, closing the circle on that. What you said about what happened with the drones coming into Poland over a period of several hours, the question is, what does it look like? What are the implications of it? What do you do? What is the state? And by the way, it's your land. So where do you go in protecting Poland?
So the Russians have been warned, I think, in that sense.
Yes, they have.
Thank you very much. I think we can take 2 or 3 questions. I'll start with General Błazeusz here on the left. And then we'll take, I think, Arik, you've raised your hand many times. I haven't given you an opportunity, so please. And if we manage, of course, because we need to have more women voices in the discussion, we'll take maybe very quickly 3 questions. General, I know you're brief, but 30 seconds, please.
Thank you. Two-folded question, General. We have established a lot of red lines and so-called caveats since the beginning of the war. We passed most of them. What's the next red line or caveat with regard to supporting Ukraine that you think we will cross eventually? And part of it is what we can do to improve the regime of controlling the movement of microchips to Russia, because our microchips from the West are still making it to Russia. Thank you.
Thank you. Could we ask the microphone next, if you can hand it to the lady? Maybe let's start with the lady and then Arik. Yes. Here, in front of me. Yeah, please. And please introduce yourself.
Miroslava Petsa, BBC News Ukrainian. I have a question about...
You have to speak up.
Yeah. I would like to ask General Kellogg about how the US is going to persuade Russia to have this trilateral with President Zelensky, because from what we can see, Putin doesn't think that Ukraine is an independent state. And even if so, how do the US make sure that after these negotiations, after maybe this conflict is frozen, there's no second war that erupts again?
Thank you very much. And last question, Arik, if you can pass the mic to, yeah, perfect.
Thank you so much, Kasia. Arik Burkowski from the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts University. I have a question about how you envision a potential ceasefire between Russia and Ukraine. Russia has said categorically that it would not accept troops from NATO countries on Ukrainian soil. Of course, we have the coalition of the willing and discussions of security guarantees, but there will be a need for monitoring and enforcement of a ceasefire. Have there been discussions about third-party participation or UN peacekeepers? I'd like to know your thoughts on that.
So let's combine these 2 questions. Thank you very much. General, first, the European troops on the ground, that was one of your mission at the beginning in February, to see whether Europeans are willing and able. They say we are willing and almost able, but it seems that the ceasefire is not happening. What does that mean?
Yeah, well, this is my personal opinion, okay? The Russians don't get a vote, okay? You want to put troops out, that's a Ukrainian decision. That's a sovereign decision of a nation. I don't care if it's Ukraine, I don't care if it's Bermuda. The fact is, you make the decision what's going to happen. The coalition of the willing is more than willing to do that. It's sort of like an aerial ceasefire. If you have a no-fly zone, that's an independent decision made, but it has to be supported probably by the alliance. So that's a big one to do that. This thing about them setting conditions, I don't think anybody should accept that. I don't, maybe Peskov says that, or maybe somebody else is going to say it. And it's one of those, to me, it's noise level. I appreciate, sort of like there's a comment I make among my team. Thank you for your interest in national defense. I really don't care what you said. Okay? So, and now the...
From our Ukrainian journalist regarding how will you force Putin to the negotiating table? What is the strategy here? How are you going to do it, the trilateral? How is it going to happen?
Well,
if you're an optimist, you believe it's going to happen.
Well, I think the way you reach, sort of like what Ukraine's doing right now, is you make this almost cost prohibitive to a level that the world is doing as well. Let's use economic sanctions as an example. Right now, what the Ukrainians are doing on hitting the refineries, which is cut their 20% of their oil production down. We're working on the people not buying on secondary sanctions, buying their oils. Unfortunately, some in Europe are still buying it. Unfortunately, a member of NATO is still buying it. The Turks are at a level of 14%. So basically cutting back because it's a petro-state. And if you take away the petrodollars, they've got an enormous problem. And that's what you want to do, the economic piece. On the diplomatic piece, I will tell you, I don't think I've ever seen, and I've spent 5 years of my military time inside NATO, actually in Europe. I've never seen the alliance as strong out there. And militarily, I'm going to make an assumption, in general, I kind of help understand this, is some of that is you kind of say, I don't know if his generals are telling him the truth or not, but he cannot overpower NATO. He cannot overpower the West. He just can't. He does not have the capacity to do it. I have talked to senior leaders in Washington, D.C., and I've been asked that very question. Can Russia win this war? I said, no, they can't. They do not have the capability to win the war after 3 years, those losses out there. And I'll use one military example because going back to what the general said is, look, I just for the heck of it, I was adding up F-35 fighters held by the Europeans. I just picked 6 nations. I count 400 F-35s, 5th generation, best fighter in the world. The Russians can put up 100. That means what I'm just telling you is you can sweep the skies overnight if you want to. You could put an air cap over Ukraine or anywhere else that nobody can match. So the capabilities are there. The question comes down to the willingness to do it. And that goes back to the risk level. Are you willing to go there and you're willing to do that? That's a hard decision to make. I know it. I know the risk level is hard. I know it. I have been there. I've been in decision making when the risk level is high. So that's kind of where we're at right now. And the calculus is now on Putin's side. And President Trump has been very, very clear about where he thinks the negotiations are, and I give him full credit for what he's doing. I know it. I've seen him work the negotiations and the transactional piece where he comes from, and he knows it pretty well. But as he said, it takes 2 to tango. I have great confidence in the Ukrainians. We know that President Zelensky's in a good position in that regard. I know his team is. I don't care if it's Umarov. I don't care if it's Andrei Yermak. I don't care who it is. They're really in good shape.
So last question, I would go back to what General Błazeusz asks. What are now the red lines? What would Putin have to do for the United States of America to directly react? And please remember, the Kremlin will be listening to this conversation.
By the way, the red lines that's a term we all hate to use because it kind of says that we've seen red lines drawn before and they've been used and been moved every time. So we don't like to use it. I think the calculus is on Putin, and the calculus is on the leadership, and basically on the pain level he's willing to accept. And right now, I mean, you look at his military forces, which underlies the administration for Putin. They've been decimated. I mean, sir, you know this. When you look at his frontline units, they were mauled in the first year of the war. And he's taking tanks out of mothballs. He's taking tanks out of museums to bring into the front lines. And drone warfare that is basically Ukrainian-based, using a little bit of what the Iranians did, is they've changed the nature of warfare to a level that we haven't seen before. We in the West don't understand what the Ukrainians are doing because we haven't studied it. But they, much like the machine gun changed war, the tank changed war, the airplane changed war, the submarine changed war, drones have changed war. And the leaders in that, technology, and we've been there. We've been to their factories, and I've been to their operational centers. They have changed the whole dynamic. So what you do is you raise the level, the pain level, the cost level to do it. But the only one you could do is draws a red line. That's in his mind, because because I think as long as the alliance is very consistent in what it's doing, I think we don't need to draw any more red lines. He's got the problem, not the West, and he's got to make that call, not the West. The West is going to be it's aligned very, very well, and I have great confidence in it as well.
General Kellogg, thank you very much for your time. We're looking forward to having you back here next year, hopefully with a resolution, peaceful resolution for this conflict, but also much more resolve on our side to deter for the long term, because we understand Russia is going nowhere and this threat will continue.
Well, the one thing I like to say is I was in Independence Day in Ukraine just a few weeks ago. I said, next year when I go back to Independence Day, hope it's a different Independence Day.
Thank you very much. A big round of applause for General Kellogg.